This makes sense! Makes sense.
Ooh. In this freeze frame, Paul looks a little drunk. So, drunk Paul versus sober Frank. Just kidding, he's not drunk. Who's here first? Amelia. This is your first time being first, right? Our token female. 10,000 pine points. Choops K, 5,000 to you. Cyanection. No, you get a bronze, not a silver. 1,000 pine points to you. And Jerome, the last video you said, last live stream you said, no, the one with Daryl Davis. You said it changed your life. Well, but you're still a loser. Oh, that's so cruel. So cruel. I thought this is hot off the press. Premiered 83 minutes ago. Only 694 views? Let's give them some more views here. They talk a lot about Star Wars and stuff like fiction. Well, I guess they talk about Jesus too, so that's fiction, right? So that's fair. No, Jesus really existed. I'm not saying he didn't. You know what's interesting is many Christians, they're not clever enough. No, that's the wrong word. They're not smart enough to realize that you can be a Christ mythicist and still believe Jesus existed historically. It's so ingrained in their brain that Jesus was exactly as it's described in the Gospels. They cannot fathom that Jesus Christ is a myth, and yet there was a man named Jesus who walked around 2,000 years ago in first century Palestine. I've gotten in so much trouble for saying that, I'm a Christ mythicist, and they go, not even Bart Ehrman says that. No, Bart Ehrman does say that. Bart Ehrman does not believe Jesus was God in flesh and walked on water and all those things. So anyhow, I'm going to fast forward. I watched this very quickly to preview it at like 2.53x, and there's enough in here that I think I can make some pithy, clever remarks, and that it might be interesting for you guys to watch. Let's see, how fast do I have this?
The Star Wars films with the Force.
This is normal speed.
Being very Eastern focused, and just the whole, not very Christian at all.
I must say I like the aquamarine background? It almost looks like a Batman symbol right here. What is that? Or is that a Bible being opened?
I was actually curious to see in Frank's book how he tied some of those things in. I think the prequel trilogy and those helped. But when I was a kid, Star Wars, I had to kind of keep that secret from my church elders for sure, that was a love of mine. Because, and
what?
It convicted me. I felt convicted that this was sort of an Eastern philosophy, and I needed to guard against that. And then...
I remember, for those of you who don't know, Paulogia and I were raised very similarly in a Mennonite culture. So things like New Age was definitely a sin. Yoga. What else? Certain types of cereal brands because they had demon-possessed symbols on them. Yeah, you had to be very careful.
That George Lucas put out, not Howard the Duck, but the one after that was Willow.
Thanks, Josh.
And Willow took it, again, another step. For those of you who are familiar with Lord of the Rings, it's Willow was in that same kind of genre, but it definitely brought in magic and all that kind of thing. And so my family definitely warned me very much
Gary Habermas is not against magic. He said he would believe in my flying man if my flying man was into magic.
against it. And then when I got recruited to go work for that company, boy, there was a lot of people praying for me and didn't think that it was a good idea for me to go work for George Lucas, specifically because his philosophies were so grounded in
Lord Jesus, we pray for Brother Paul. He's going into that god-awful, secular, pagan religion of Star Wars. Put a hedge of protection around him, Lord, so those evil influences of Lucas does not invade his soul. So he'll be possessed by demons. Lord, we pray that that will not happen. True story. I bet you that's what they prayed.
actually everything. So he has a Christian background,
Sure.
of course, because he's North American, but he went out seeking to find every philosophy and to throw everything in. As you know, people who studied Star Wars know, Star Wars is this ultimate potpourri of inspirations
Good
from
word.
Flash Gordon and samurai movies and everything that George watched as a kid. He threw those all into one pot and made this
Potpourri.
beautiful soup called Star Wars.
I
So-
should have called this Paulogia and Frank Turek Potpourri Apologetics. That is so much better. Is it too late for me to change it? Live streaming, edit, title, Paul and Frank Turek. Yeah, I can still change it. How do you spell potpourri? Poutpourrie. Is that right? No, that's not right. That doesn't look right. Potpourri. Yeah, that's right. Paulogia and Frank Turek, Potpourri Apologetics. That's a great name for a new Christian apologetics channel. In fact, no, Frank should change his from cross-examine to Potpourri Apologetics. And we'll see later why that is, because he just throws everything in here later.
there was definitely a huge tension. So I admire what Frank was doing in his book. I think when I was a Christian, I would have taken a very similar approach. He mentioned when Paul, the apostle, not myself, was being spoken to when he was in front of the Greeks, and he noticed that there was a pillar to the unknown God, and he was able to use that to take
Is the T really silent? Potpourri? Is it?
what the Greeks knew and what they experienced to point to his message. That's a very admirable take. I get, at least Frank, that's what I took away from your book, was that's what you're trying to say is, hey, you know what? If you're having a conversation about the new Spider-Man film, you don't have to shy away from that or look down on someone for being influenced by the pop culture. That hey, let's spin that into a for spiritual laws type
I'd
thing.
be interested in your because I feel like attitudes have changed quite a bit in the Christian church in that sense, Frank. It's not nearly as controversial as perhaps it was in Paul's day, to say, yeah, I'm a Star Wars fan, or a Harry Potter fan, which we equally had its detractors in the Christian church. I'm sure there are still people who don't like it or disapprove of it, but you obviously believe, Frank, that you don't have to kind of imbibe a particular spirituality or start believing in witchcraft to be able to draw a Christian message from these films.
No, I don't think you have to imbibe in it to the point that you actually believe in it. After all, these are fantasies, right? I mean, Paul well knows, since he was on the inside of this, and he just pointed out that it's a potpourri of different beliefs. They're not...
There's that word again. And by the way, I don't care if the rest of this is boring. I learned something new today. Like, this is fantastic. Because at my age, when you learn something new, like, you got to cherish it. The T is silent in potpourri. Potpourri. Because it's French, right? Thank you, Mannerite. 1,000 pine points to Mannerite for, if I was to go into a debate with Frank Turek and say, I have a potpourri of reasons to think that Jesus didn't, I would have been laughed off stage. But now they're going to say, oh, at PineCreek, he's an educated francophone. He knows that T is silent.
Many of them are mutually contradictory, but it doesn't matter. It's a movie. It's a story, right? And if you could only read or
It
look
doesn't matter. It's a movie. It's a story, right? The Gospels, it doesn't matter. It's a story, right?
at things that were always true and right, you couldn't even read the Bible. Because the Bible has many activities in it.
What did he just say?
And if you could only read or look at things that were always true and right, you couldn't even read the Bible.
Oh, that's a great clip. Because there's a lot of things wrong in the Bible?
Because the Bible has many activities in it that God does not approve of. Well, let's just say the adultery of David and Bathsheba. It's recorded in there as a description.
But if God commanded David to have sex with coitus with Bathsheba, then it would be right, right?
But it's not a prescription for us. In fact, Paul even says in both Romans and...
See, now I got it wrong again. This is, who cares about Frank Turek? And who cares about Paulogia? It's not even it's pa? Or it sounds like o? So is it Potpourri or is it Potpourri? Like, who cares about this unbelievable podcast? We got to get this right. And I don't want to cheat and Google it. What is it? Is it Potpourri or is it Potpourri? Oh, Paul just messaged me on Facebook. He's going to tell me the correct. I'm doing my own after show thing later tonight, so I myself should save thoughts for that. Oh, okay. No problem. We are just discussing how to properly... spelled properly wrong, but who cares? Properly pronounce the word potpourri. Okay, so I just messaged Paul.
I think 1 Corinthians, that these stories were written down to help us, as examples to us, to help us know what to do and what not to do. So if you can't in any way engage in stories that have either sinful or dark behavior in them at all, you couldn't even read the Bible.
Yeah. Let's talk about Star Wars a bit, because that was the...
Justin Bradley just glossed over that. I don't care. But yeah, you know, the Bible is rated R. In fact, I'm going to chastise all you Christian parents out there right now. Do not give your 10-year-olds the Bible and let them sit in their room with it. It's rated R. There's sex and violence. There's even nudity in the Bible. And you just say, here, take it. Put it right next to your bed, son. Shame on you, parents. You gotta be there with them when they read that Bible, because you think they can understand this? Doug, were you this sarcastic when you were a Christian? I can't imagine that. Of course, I didn't change my personality type just because I left Christianity. I've always been this way. And where's the sarcasm? I've been talking mostly about how to pronounce words.
Specific one I wanted to focus on. I mean, you cover a whole range of heroes: Iron Man, Captain America, Harry Potter.
I don't care about this.
It's just there's a good side and a bad side, but it's not giving you a command, because it's not a personal being. It's not issuing commands. And so when you watch the movie as an audience, you know that the Jedi are the good guys and say the Sith are the bad guys, or Darth Vader and his crew are the bad guys.
Do we really know that they're the good guys? Because didn't they do indoctrination? The young Jedi minds. Don't they even give some bad advice once in a while?
Because you already have a moral law written on your heart. But as Lucas points out, it's morally neutral because it's an impersonal force. So this is not the God of the Bible, certainly. I think Paul would agree with that. But that's okay. I mean, this is a fantasy story.
And the Jedi, they kind of almost strike me, though, almost as if there is a religious element to it, they are the priests almost. They're almost these monk-like characters, aren't they, who kind of steward this, the light side, let's say, of this force.
They even look like monks.
And so on. So the Jedi are almost seen as a religious order. I get the sense in the books. And
Yeah.
I've never blocked you, Walter. What are you talking about?
I think I'd agree with you there, Justin. I don't know what
I
you
was
think
happened to
about
be
that, Paul.
around when some of the stuff was being written, so yeah, I definitely know that the Jedi and the fall of the Jedi was specifically intended to be somewhat allegorical to the ties of the church to the state. In George had held Paul. I was a Christian the whole time I worked there. So
Oh. See? Paul used to work with Lucas. I call him Lucas because I never worked with Lucas. But if you work with Lucas, you call him George. So me and George, we're sipping Diet Cokes and we're talking about the movie.
So I didn't share George's politics at all, but I was fly on the wall to know that certainly there was meant to be.
He didn't share George's politics at all, but he worked with him. Oh, too soon?
Some monastic things and some commentary on what happens when the church and the state are too tied together, and some of the problems that can lead to. So yeah, for sure, the Jedi Order was there.
Yeah.
And in terms of the Force, yeah, as you say, it's an impersonal force. In Episode 4, in the first film that came out, C-3PO dunks into an oil bath and he says, "Thank the Maker, this feels so good." The Maker is actually a character in
He became a moist robot. You get it? Yeah, you get it.
Star Wars universe, so that the Force, even in George's mind, right from the start, there was a maker of the universe and the Force, and that they were separate things, and the Force was more of an element that came in there. And
Yeah, it sounds like two parts of the Trinity, right? You got the Creator God, Yahweh, and then you got the Holy Spirit, the Force, who changes your heart.
as you may remember, in 1999, when The Phantom Menace came out, they introduced midichlorians, which were a thing that happened in the Star Wars universe that gave the Force some scientific basis. And I noticed that
Yeah, that's what we need for the Holy Spirit. Christians, you got to work on that. You need a word, like when someone's really filled with the Holy Spirit, they need a high level of, you can't use midichlorians. You gotta come up with a new name. And when you're like a backslidden Christian, you're low on whatever. What would be a good name? Someone think of a good name instead of midichlorians. Is it meta? See, now I don't know how to pronounce anything.
Self included, as a Christian, I was outraged. Why are we trying to give a scientific reason for this great mystical thing that you had going? What was once magic? George actually kind of walked down that path with the films. If you want to see it, it was
Crystochlorians. I like it, doorknob head. Crystochlorians. So Pentecostals have high levels of crystochlorians. Oh, that's really good. It just rolls off the mouth. Crystochlorians. And Calvinists have a very low level of crystochlorians.
It was very mystical in the first ones. In the second one, we could answer it with science. We could take someone's blood and determine how much force they had going. And then, you jump to Episode 7 with Disney. They threw Han Solo back in the mix, and Han Solo, who's the ultimate skeptic in the original trilogy, now says it's true. All of it's true. And what that was the first Star Wars film I watched as a skeptic. And so it was interesting for me to watch and say, oh, that is how...
You know what Frank Turek is thinking here when Paul's talking? Like,
true. All of it's true. And that was the first Star Wars film I watched as a skeptic. And so it was interesting for me to watch and say, oh, that is how...
That's what he's thinking.
I would want to be, is that Han Solo came to that because he saw evidence. Han Solo he didn't believe because of the stories that he was told. He didn't believe because of eyewitness accounts or legends. It was when he had sufficient evidence shown to him that was repeatable, and he saw it over and over, and that's when he accepted it to be true. So it's this weird journey from mysticism to much less mysticism in the Star Wars universe, which I know some fans don't like, but that's been the trend.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, you talk a bit in your own book, Frank, about the Han Solo as an interesting example of someone who goes from this kind of hard-bitten, cynical skeptic in the first set of movies to, as Paul said in the final one before he...
No, Darth Dawkins is not a Sith Lord. Thank you for the donation, though. No, he's, in order to be a Sith Lord, you got to pass a very stringent IQ test. And Darth failed.
Guys, I'm sorry, there are going to be spoilers, I'm afraid, in this in this. If you haven't watched the Star Wars films, where have you been, frankly? But the point is that yeah, he goes on this kind of journey. Now it's interesting. Paul says that's because it kind of has a more, in a sense, rational, scientific basis ultimately that it gets transformed into. What's your feeling on the change of mind of Han Solo, Frank?
Well, I think Paul's right that it is based on evidence. And of course, as Christians, I would argue that our view is based on evidence as well, that we know God by his effects. So an effect is...
See, this is a bit of a contradiction that I hear from apologists. We know God by his effects. And those effects are often empirical, yes? And then at the same time, I think people like Frank Turek and maybe Frank himself have said you cannot put God in a test tube. In other words, you can't test God. You can't say, oh, yeah, we can measure God in any way, but can you not measure the effects of God in any way? Am I the only one who's noticed this? It seems like there's some friction there.
If that's...
Affect. Yeah, you affect something, and then you look at it later and say that was the effect. What is this becoming English class? Pronouncing words and getting them.
It's an effect, then we must reason back to a cause, a creator. A design is an effect, so we reason back to a cause, a designer. We have a moral law written on our hearts. That's an effect, so we're reasoning back to a moral law giver. We have this ability to be rational. That's the effect. So we're reasoning back to a mind. So we're taking effects and reasoning them back to a cause. And that's of course, the scientific worldview. And I think that Paul's right that when Han Solo sees these things actually happening, he doesn't just blindly go, oh, guess I'm going to believe in the Force now. He actually sees the effects of the Force. So he reasons back to a cause known as the Force. And I'm looking at a quote here by George Lucas, who said this. He said, I put the Force into the movies in order to try and awaken a certain kind of spirituality in young people, more a belief in God than any particular religious system. Now, of course...
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, in today's day and age, Lucas was more successful than Jesus. Like, aren't there more young people today into Star Wars than into the Bible?
When he said that, inevitably, he's going to have to put forth some sort of religious system. And in his view, it turned out to be this pantheistic kind of potpourri, as Paul said, of these different beliefs that's more mystical, less personal.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes then, Paul, to the kind of the moral element of this, I mean, it's interesting.
Here we
Frank
go.
Says the Force is kind of neutral in the film, but we bring our presuppositions about where good and evil lie.
You know where this is going.
Jedi, the good guys,
Are
and
they?
the Sith are the bad guys, and everything else. Well, that's I suppose that's the point. Is there in the Star Wars universe? Firstly, do you think there is a strong sense that there is a real right and wrong, objective good and evil? And I suppose as an atheist, my question is, in our universe,
Only the Sith deal in absolutes.
do you believe that exists as well, and that's kind of what we're keying
So Frank would be a Sith.
into when we understand the battle between good and evil in this or any other?
Well, certainly when
superhero
it comes
movie.
to that film franchise, it's intended to be that you walk in and you see the kids know from looking only at the toys which ones are the good guys and which ones are the bad guys. I mean, that's how it was designed to sell toys. So I mean, certainly that element is...
Now the truth comes out. All the Star Wars movies were designed to sell toys. If only God had the marketing prowess of George Lucas, I mean, things would be way different. Like how many Jesus dolls have been sold lately? Oh, the Catholics, they have a whole bunch of them on their wall, right?
there. And the interesting thing is, as we delve deeper with the Clone Wars series, I was involved with slightly, and then as we're getting into the new Obi-Wan series, there's a lot of trying to deconstruct in a way this whole Jedi notion and were they actually the good guys. And one of the stories I wrote that got involved with was at the time the implication is the Jedi are stealing babies, right, to come and to bring them to the temple. Like, is that a good thing or not? Like, so there was this whole Jedi Order.
Frank's, I feel like playing the Enya music here. What? They stole babies?
It's now being deconstructed in a funny way, and while I'm excited to see where the Obi-Wan series goes, but In terms of if that is involved in the world, well, no, all the things that Frank listed there, I don't think that we need to go back to some kind of ontological effect in the same way Frank does.
Oh, that's a trigger word for Frank.
I feel like that the natural world in and of itself, so let's just stick with morality and the good versus evil. The fact that we are a social species and our survival advantage is that we are social, and the more we work together, and we do need to have our own individual selfishness in order to stay alive, to reproduce, but we try and curtail that again for the survivability of the race. And if we don't survive, then our
die.
Species doesn't continue. That is enough of a reason to say, hey, you know what? We're going to look at someone who's strong and altruistic. That is going to be a hero.
He's describing me.
Because that meets both of our survival needs. They are strong. They might be a good provider. They can help protect us. But also, that person, gives himself, not necessarily gives their life, although they might. Frank gives some good examples in the book of people in real life who've given their lives. That doesn't need a grounding beyond the survivability and the other things.
So
I know that
in a nutshell, it's a kind of social kind of evolution, really, that drives our admiration for those kinds of figures, heroic figures who
right. And I think the cross-cultural nature of it tells us that this is part of our survivability. This is part of our biology. Not.
Did you see what happened there? Paul was actually talking a little bit too much for too long. And Justin, he's a pro. He just gently said, so. It's good. It's really good.
Not just the cultural context, because these archetypes tend to flow across cultures and time. So again, that's the undeniable part where we start to speculate as to why this is the case. So.
Frank, quick response before we go to our first break.
Yeah, I this is the interesting part of the conversation for me, because I want to know the grounding of morality.
Do you though? Do you really want to know the grounding for morality, or do you use this as an apologetic to show that your belief in God and Jesus is true?
If there is no God, then how can we say that, say, the Allies were right and the Nazis were wrong? If the Allies are trying to protect their population and the Nazis are trying to protect their population, how do we adjudicate between those two? If the atheistic worldview is right and there is no purpose to life, then how can we say...
No ultimate purpose for life. You forgot that adjective, Frank, because you agree that anybody can come up with their own purpose, but it doesn't really mean anything unless it's ultimate, which is synonym for God. Ultimate purpose means God purpose.
That it is the Allies who are right because they have the more noble purpose, and the Nazis are wrong because they don't.
Well,
the thing is, couldn't a Christian make the argument that the Holocaust was God's will? Don't Calvinist Christians say that all the time? Everything's been decreed, even the Holocaust, for morally sufficient reasons. That when God created the universe and planet Earth, he foresaw that and said, I'm going to allow it. We're going to do it. I'm going to create it knowing that this is going to happen.
The only way we can adjudicate anything is by agreeing to an adjudicator and agreeing to a set of rules that we will go to an arbiter. You can't just declare that the ref is on your side and therefore the ref will always rule on your team. I think one of the things, you need to, for anyone to agree that the Nazis were wrong and the Allies were right, you would need to at least agree upon some goals of human flourishing or some goals of equality. And you've talked about this before. You know that goals can get you to a certain, explain, epistemologically how we get there. The question is, do we need anything beyond that for this God? What does the God bring you other than the idea that this is a tiebreaker who's on my side all the time? Like, that doesn't...
Yeah, this is... what Paulogia is talking about here is the gravitas issue. It's the only... I think the reason why a lot of Christians like Frank want this grounding to be God, to say, hey, this is not my opinion. The boss upstairs says so you better do it. And if you don't, sometimes the boss can get nasty.
Mean anything really,
Right. I'm not talking about the epistemological issue, Paul. I'm talking about the ontological issue. Let's suppose Hitler had won World War II and convinced everybody that murdering Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses was a good thing. Would it be a good thing? If you had a majority saying, yeah, this is a good thing.
Well, that depends on how
Okay, now listen to what Frank says here.
That murdering Jews, let's suppose Hitler had won World War II and convinced everybody that murdering Jews, homosexuals,
Let's presuppose that God ordered the killing of Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and whatever else, Canaanites. Then it would be good, right, Frank? So it's just based on different standards, which is what Paul's talking about.
Gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses was a good thing. Would it be a good thing? If you had a majority saying, yeah, this is a good thing.
Well, that depends on how you define good, obviously.
Yep.
And you might, again, if the people who lived in such a world no longer agreed that persecution and these kind of things were wrong, then they wouldn't. And that means they would be abandoning some of their biology. They'd be abandoning the idea of empathy. They'd be abandoning the idea of preservation as a species, which seems the reason why we feel like it's instinctive that would be the case is because it's built into our biology. I guess you and I just disagree. I don't think we need anything beyond the natural to have the ontological step. I understand you do, but I just don't see it, and I would love to be, to help to show why that's even necessary. A tiebreaker.
It's necessary because you need that gravitas. You need that force behind it, Frank would say. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of humans defining what good is. And we can't have that. We need this all-powerful being to lay down the law.
Doesn't make it... The fact that we would need a tiebreaker doesn't make it necessary.
I'm not really talking about a tiebreaker. I'm talking about what is the good. If it's just my opinion or your opinion or Hitler's opinion or...
See, didn't he just say, I'm talking about ontology, not epistemology? And then he's asking, well, what is the good? Isn't that more of an epistemic question? How do we know what is good? What is it? So you can say that there is an objective moral good, but what is it? That's epistemology, right? I'm not a philosopher. Maybe Danny, if he's in the live stream chat, he can just say thumbs up, thumbs down.
Or Churchill's opinion, then it's just subjective. Is there an objective standard of good beyond humanity? It seems if there isn't, it's just one person's opinion.
Yeah, and you notice how Christians like Frank Turek want to say that God is a person, actually three persons, but yet it's not subjective. So they define objective as outside of humanity. But isn't God within humanity too? Like he lives in the life of the believer? So God is a person, three persons, according to Frank. He's a subject who has an opinion that flows from his nature of what's good. So you're still left with this subjectivity. The subject is just the creator of the universe. That's all. Just, right?
Against another. So I'm not talking about epistemology, how do we know right and wrong? I'm talking about what is the ultimate standard of goodness. Maybe an illustration will help. Let's use soccer because it's the international game. How do you know that
called football.
Team scoring a goal is better than the other team scoring a goal? Well, the only way you could know that if you knew the purpose of the game, right?
What? There's no such thing as a better goal scored. It's just a goal's, the soccer ball's in the net or it's not.
Purpose to the game, you can't say that a goal for your side is better than a goal for the other side. You have to know the purpose. And it seems to me if there's no purpose to the game, you can't adjudicate. And if there's no purpose to life, you can't say that murdering Jews, homosexuals, and gypsies is a bad thing.
Oh, gypsies was the other one. Yeah, but if God wanted gypsies killed, then it would be a good thing, right?
And loving them is a good thing.
Well, that's an interesting example you give because, of course, everyone on the soccer pitch needs to agree what the rules are or else there is no game. And so they all assent to what the rules are. But you say purpose of the game. the purpose of the game may not be for everyone to win. There's some people who are on the pitch to win the game. Some people, the purpose to be there is to make their parents proud. Some people, the purpose to be there is to get exercise. Everyone comes with their own purpose.
Paul's losing me here now. You mean there's a purpose to playing sports other than winning? Can someone? I need a translator. Like I'm a competitive capitalist. This does not compute. I mean, people do sports for other reasons. Goals to win, Paul, and make the other side cry.
But they've all agreed. Oh, you know what? While we're on the field, these are the rules we're going to go by, so that we can objectively know whether one move is better than another move. That doesn't mean.
I'm not supposed to use the word gypsies. Well, it's a good thing Matt Dillahunty isn't here, because if he were here, then he'd be gone.
That there is some grander purpose to soccer.
It's so hard on him.
Right, but you wouldn't be able to adjudicate between a good play and a bad play unless there was a purpose. No, I agree that in soccer, we're using an illustration here. The rules are arbitrary. They could be different, right? But if there is a God, then the rules come from his nature, and they're not arbitrary. If there is no God, then everything's arbitrary. It's just Hitler's opinion.
I'll let you come back on this in a moment, Paul. We're going to go to a break. Fascinating that we've already got well into the moral argument on the back of the dark versus the light side of Star Wars. But we're going to continue talking about Star Wars superheroes and only that time on Unbelievable. There are many more shows that we could point people to on that issue. But
my apologies to Justin Briley from the Unbelievable podcast for fast forwarding through his commercial breaks.
There are, lots of kind of themes that emerge from all of these movies you mentioned in the book, Frank. Sticking with Star Wars, though, one thing, again, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen the original set of films, but it turns out that Darth Vader is Luke's dad, Anakin Skywalker, and the ultimate baddie eventually finds redemption in the final film.
The ultimate what?
Just explain those scenes for those who maybe haven't seen them, Frank, and what you draw out there about how that connects as far as you see it with the Christian story.
Well, it turns out, and Paul could probably speak more authoritatively on this than I can because he's on the inside of these Star Wars films, and my son is a real expert on the films, but as I see Darth Vader, Luke is his counterpoint. Whereas Darth Vader, first of all, Anakin, he is controlled by fear and his emotions, whereas Luke is able to control fear and control his emotions and do what's right. Even in the final scene where Luke is trying to redeem his father and the Emperor try and get him to lose his composure and to totally go off and join the dark side, but Luke continues to pull himself back. He can control his fear, he can control his emotion, and Darth Vader...
No, Mark, we've already settled in on the Christian equivalent to metachlorians. It's crystochlorians.
Anakin Skywalker couldn't do that, and it's ultimately what led him to become Darth Vader. Yet Luke has faith that he can turn his father, and of course... Darth Vader says, it's too late for me, son. I can't do the voice.
You need to do that.
Sounds like a dog.
That muffled, heavy breathing if you're going to do Darth Vader.
That's right.
Don't you, Frank? Yeah. But carry on.
That's right. But Luke will not.
We have someone in the live stream chat who's never seen Star Wars. Jerome, where were you raised?
Give up, and he ultimately is able to help redeem his father. And we have a question in the book Hollywood Heroes: can bad people go to heaven? Somebody like Darth Vader. And of course, in the Star Wars series, there is an afterlife. Darth Vader appears in a kind of a trilogy.
Yoda's there,
and with Obi-Wan.
Yoda,
who else is it?
Yeah, so Yoda and Obi-Wan kind of who.
Yoda, that's right.
It's like Jedi come back as these kind of ghostly type figures after they've died, don't they?
That's a whole mess, but yeah, some of them.
And guide them, some of them. Oh, okay. you know more about this than me,
in
Paul.
fact,
go ahead, though.
As I understand it, Paul, Lucas went back and actually digitally put...
Yeah, so he put... Yeah, it was initially Sebastian Shaw, I think.
something like that. Yeah.
But the real interesting thing is we answer the question, can bad people go to heaven? And the answer is only bad people go to heaven. Because anyone is redeemable, because you don't gain salvation by moral success or lose it by moral failure. It's all.
Do bad people go to heaven? Only bad people go to heaven. Do good people go to hell? And only good people go to hell? So if bad people go to heaven, Frank wouldn't say that. So if only bad people go to heaven and only bad people go to hell, what's this justice we're talking about? Where's the justice in this? And then he says this.
Because you don't, and the answer is only bad people go to heaven. Because anyone is redeemable, because you don't gain salvation by moral success or lose it by moral failure. It's all grace.
You don't lose salvation through moral failure? You sure about that, Frank? You want to take a mulligan on that? I thought we're punished for our sins. And that punishment's eternal conscious torment. I think that's Frank's version of Christianity. Isn't this an oops?
Salvation by moral success or lose it by moral failure. It's all grace. And so
if it's all grace, then even you choosing to accept the gift is not what got you to heaven. Right? This is the problem. There's so many plot holes.
So once Darth Vader decided that he had had enough of the Emperor and he was going to side with Luke, he was redeemed. And so there is an
it's
afterlife,
works-based, of course.
Yeah, that's a works thing. Choose ye who you will serve. For me and my family, we will serve the Lord. That's a choice. And that takes work and commitment and discipline. You Christians should be proud of yourselves for what you do. Stop with this false humility. You guys are great.
Yeah, so that's kind of, in a sense, it's the story of redemption told in the Star Wars kind of mode. Now, obviously, he doesn't turn to Christ to have his sins forgiven. It's kind of some kind of,
right.
I've turned to the light side from the dark side kind of motif going on. But I suppose, that theme is there, isn't it? This idea that even bad people, even someone as awful as Darth Vader, in his final moments, he receives redemption. And somehow we're okay with that, aren't we? And that's interesting.
Somehow we're okay with that. Somehow we're okay with Christ redeeming the serial rapist. Somehow we're okay with that.
Paul, what's your feeling on this idea of the salvation ultimately of Darth Vader and how it might relate to the Christian story?
One can draw the afterlife connections. Those are obvious in the Star Wars universe. It's actually very much a works-based system on who gets to live afterwards. There's no one you put your trust in. The interesting thing about Luke, and you were saying Luke with the fear, and I'm preaching on the wrong side of this here, but that's fine. Luke was connected with people. Luke had a connection with Leia and with his friends that Anakin didn't have. Anakin felt like he was betrayed by everyone, and that he lost all of his friends, and it was this loss of connection.
Yeah, he was just misunderstood.
Ultimately, that made Anakin go to the dark side, as opposed to Luke, who found his family, right? His selected family, and so I think those could be drawn to Christian themes. I'm sure as well. Frank has great ways of connecting all these stories to Sunday school type lessons. But again, I kind of, if I'm arguing on the naturalistic side of things, these are the kind of things that people do find, their redemption in, that you put others before yourself, and that, in an altruistic social species, that is considered a great virtue, whether with or without a God. That altruism.
Hey, Paul, you don't want to talk to Christians and call them a species. They don't like that.
And finding your family and love, are things that we humans value.
But how is that explained, Paul? Why would altruism be something that a naturalistic worldview would find valuable if altruism doesn't help you survive? Or
What? If it okay,
altruism doesn't help you propagate your genes. Like for example, the example we use in the book is Michael Monsor, who a true life Navy SEAL who dove on a grenade to save his friends. We all know that's a wonderful, noble act he did, but it doesn't make sense on the naturalistic worldview. It seems.
It didn't help his genes survive, but it helped his tribe's genes survive, right? It helped his two fellow servicemen lived because he jumped on that grenade versus just his own. I mean, we as a society, because we rely on each other, it doesn't need to be our own genes that survive. We're a social species, and that's where we find those answers, and that's where the cooperation is what we end up valuing, because that's the only real advantage that humans have over other animals. We have our intelligence and we have our ability to work together. And that's
Great answer,
why
Paul.
in a naturalistic view, I don't need anything more transcendent than to say that my tribe is better off when people give more to it than they take from it.
Right, but now we're going back into the moral argument here.
Sure.
We're saying, like, what if the Nazi tribe says, well, we're going to kill you because we're going to create the super race, right? And we're going to do that. That's what we think is a good thing. Why are they wrong if they try and kill another tribe?
Well, on a macro scale, so on a micro scale, it may not have.
because the people who they're killing don't want to be killed and don't deserve to be killed because they're a Jew. Isn't it as simple as that?
But on this macro scale, it's interesting that the Nazis were defeated because the whole world came together and said, you know what? That's not the way that all of us can flourish. So when you step back on this altruism, the bigger the scope of what you consider to be in your tribe, that's where we start to see these moral plays come out and work together. And again, I just don't see why a God is necessary for that. That was in the benefit of the whole planet, that the bad apples be stopped. And we call them a bad apple, not because there's intrinsic evil in the world, but because we did not like the actions that were being performed. It was subjective. Some people like it.
So you're saying that morality ultimately is subjective then?
Well, morality is, I think that bears it out. I think every single individual you talk to will think that certain things are moral and certain things aren't. You don't have a
Yeah, see, this is where Paul and I are different. If you would ask, so you think morality is subjective then? I'd say yes. Pause. And then Frank's going to say something about, but then opinion, blah, 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 who's to say, blah, blah, blah. And you can just flip that right back on to him with his God. Why ought we listen to what your God has to say? Why isn't a group of people's opinion better than God's? Tell me. And more importantly, how can we know for sure that this is what this God wants when it comes to morality? What's our mechanism? Is there a certain phone line we can pick up and say, hey, God, we got this issue here. We need your help. It's a moral issue. This is the context, blah, blah, blah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Okay. Got it. Thanks, God. Like, do we have that? Yes, Doug, we do. It's called the Bible.
Consensus on these things. But the thing is, we are biologically wired to tend to appreciate altruism and tend to appreciate, the tribe.
Unless you're David Wood.
Those are, again, we're kind of going in circles a bit on that, Justin, but I feel like that's an adequate grounding.
Okay, so then essentially we're back to the epistemological question then. How do we know morality? And you're saying it's hardwired into our system. Well, that would also mean then that every thought we have is hardwired into our system. So why should...
You know what's interesting about this? I don't think Frank disagrees. He would say that morality is hardwired into our system because of God. He puts it upon our hearts. Isn't he on record saying stuff like this? So knowing that Frank agrees with Paul, what Paul just says, now what is he going to say?
Then that every thought we have is hardwired into our system. So why should we believe anything's true?
Well, and you think you probably would know that I would just affirm that and say, absolutely, I'm a determinist. So I do believe that the what's in our heads is determined by what the environment around us and the chemicals firing in our brains. I absolutely think that.
So then we would have no grounds to, even in an evolutionary way, to condemn Hitler or Putin or anybody doing evil.
Well,
yeah, you just say, I condemn Hitler. And then someone will say, why? Because I don't think Jews should be killed. Well, you can't ground it. You say, so what? I think I can. You just disagree. It's pretty simple.
So I would have grounds to condemn them because of what I value.
Yeah.
But yes, in this grand sense, no, like there's nothing outside. I don't see why we need something outside of us than to say, you know what, I prefer not to be murdered. And so I can imagine that other people also don't like to be murdered. So I'm going to label that wrong. I tend to think that wrong is what we label the outcomes we don't like, and good is what we label the outcomes that we do like.
Yes.
And if you look at it that way, the fact that we lazily say good and bad for our own preferences doesn't mean that they aren't our own preferences.
But like I can tell Frank, this does not make sense to Frank. It goes against that little clip I have. He's like, how can this be? Like, there's no way. You got to have some behind it. And there's no behind this. That's exactly what he's thinking. He's groaning inside.
Right, but let me just try and follow this through, and I'm excited that we can talk about this, because rarely do I get to talk about this in an in-depth way with people who have an opposite worldview, unfortunately.
Now, why is that? I remember hearing this when I was listening to it, previewing it at 3X, and I'm going, what? You're an apologist for decades. What, 30 years now? And you say this?
I'm excited that we can talk about this, because rarely do I get to talk about this in an in-depth way with people who have an opposite worldview, unfortunately.
That is your fault, Frank. Let me make a recommendation to you if you ever see this, or if anybody has Frank's ear and can relay this message. Why don't you have, you know how I have Theist Thursday? Why don't you have Atheist Wednesday or something, where you don't allow anybody to call in unless they're an atheist or opposite worldview to you? I guess that would be atheist. And then you can have in-depth conversations about this stuff. The fact that you're saying this now is like, shame on you. It makes it sound like you're in a bubble. Like, all you do, Frank, is go from apologetic conference to apologetic conference to apologetic conference, and the only time you interact with someone with an opposite worldview to you is in the Q&A period at the end, right? And maybe afterwards in the foyer. But you can't have an in-depth conversation like this, right? Yeah, oh, there you go. Talliver Heath. Sinner Saturday. No, Sinner Sunday is better. Once a week on Sundays, after you're done going to church and you come home and have your, I'll just say this for Paul because he's a Mennonite. After you have your Matterschlope, which is an afternoon sleep. So you go to church, have your afternoon sleep, you wake up, and you have Sinner Sunday, where you can have in-depth conversations with atheists like me.
If you're going to say that every thought you have is the result of, say, the laws of physics, it's determined, then your very preferences are determined as well. Correct. Including the preference that you like love and the preference that, say, maybe Hitler likes murder.
Hitler also liked love. He just did it. His flavor of what he called love was different. But yeah. I mean, it's our. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Just absolutely, our individual preferences. Sorry, what was the question again?
So I guess it's if everything.
Yeah, that happens to me too. Don't sweat it, Paul. And Justin's a pro here and kind of bails Paul out.
Thing is determined. I think Frank's problem with that is that then you can't say that Hitler was right or wrong. He was just following his kind of chemical nature.
No, you can't say Hitler was right or wrong. The real question is, whoever says Hitler's right or wrong, are they right or wrong? And so forth. But this whole idea, no, you can't say Hitler was really right or wrong. Yeah, people can have their opinions just like God has his opinion. And I know, I say that on purpose because I know it bothers Christians to hear it put that way. But really, it is God's opinion that flows from his nature, yes? And the only reason why I think people like Frank says you ought to listen to it is because he's strong. And he can squash you like a bug if you don't. And he can see the future.
Sure, you are following your chemical nature. There is no right or wrong to really talk about in there.
And I would say if we value human life, and if we value altruism, if we set that goal, just like you said, if we come up with rules to the soccer game that we agree to, if we agree that the things, human flourishing and reducing suffering are good, then we can say certain things are good or bad. But you can't say something is good or bad without knowing what you're comparing it to. And even if God exists, and even if God is...
Yeah, see, if I was there, I would just say to Frank, yeah, we can say something's right or wrong based on a standard. Done.
The perfect moral being, the fact that Frank is comparing his decision-making to what God would say versus someone like me who is not taking God into consideration at all, proves that it is, that on an individual basis, it completely is subjective. Even if God exists and he is the absolute best thing to choose, we are all subjectively choosing something.
Yeah, this is a great point by Paul here. So even if God exists and there's this thing called objective morality, i.e. God morality, you still have to, each person still has to choose to follow it, listen to it, accept it, yes? And then it becomes subjective morality again. In other words, Paul and I have a standard called, let's say, well-being. And if we see something that goes against that standard, we can say, that's bad. But we, as subjects, make that choice to say, here's my standard, and here's my association with that standard to make a judgment call. Christians, you do the exact same thing. You just substitute well-being to the outflowing of God's nature. But you subjectively choose that standard to follow. See, we're bringing people together. We're building a bridge. We're all the same.
Well, our decisions are always in us, the subject, but do they have an external referent that's an object? That's the question.
Is God an object? No, he's a subject. God's a person, a personal God. You want to oops on that one, Frank? Unless he's saying morality is an object, but no, morality flows from the personal God's nature. You're making God sound so impersonal, Frank.
For example, I may say 2 + 2 = 3, and you say 2 + 2 = 4. They're both subjective decisions, but you're actually right and I'm wrong because there's an object outside of ourselves, a mathematical grid that I think is grounded in the mind of God. I guess what I'm trying to get at is if our moral preferences come from evolution, then so do our thoughts come from evolution, including the thought that atheism is true. And so there's no way for you and I to have a real...
You know what's interesting about this, and I'm not sure how Calvinistic leaning Frank is, but I think he is. Even your thought to accept Jesus Christ as Lord in your life, predetermined in many Christians' views. And if not predetermined to be, what do they call it, an efficient cause or whatever, it's at least a huge, huge influence of the Holy Spirit guiding you to the truth of the gospel, right? So in a lot of ways, we're in the same boat. Here I am building a bridge again.
Debate as to whether or not Christianity or atheism is true, because if we're both governed by the laws of physics, we're not even uttering truth claims. We're just uttering what the laws of physics are telling us.
But truth, if you define truth as I do, as how well something conforms to reality, as adjudicated by predictive power, then we can see if our statements make predictions, and if they make predictions, those can be tested, and those can be tested whether or not our brains are rational or whether they're reliable, all those kind of things. Because,
but they,
well, I was going to say, is, if I predict that there's a door behind me, if that's the truth claim that I want to make, if I go and walk over and I can't.
One thing popped in my head about the whole idea of is our reasoning reliable? And Christians want to say yes, because God is the preconditions for intelligibility. This is the precept shtick. But if the humans Makes it sound like I'm a robot. I am a robot. I'm waiting for my software update. But if we humans, if our reasoning is reliable, then why aren't we all Christians? Right?
Leave the room, well then that truth claim is not there. The fact that our brains are basically good enough is not a good reason to rely on them. That's why we don't like to rely on our brains, and that's why science and philosophy, like laws of logic, you come up with all these rules to accommodate the fact that our brains didn't evolve to become truth machines. They evolved to be survival machines, and that's why we actually need these other parameters around us, but they are good enough for us to...
I sure hope Paul says the phrase moist robots in this.
If we are acting rational, to make predictive tests, and that's really all we need.
But in order to evaluate whether something is predictive and accurate, we need a mind that can follow the evidence where it leads, not just follow the laws.
Why? Well, I guess I gotta know what he means by mind. But I think he means like some intangible poofiness, some immaterial squidginess. Why do we need this mind to do this?
Of physics. So it seems to me that any effort to prove materialism would require materialism to be false. So you can actually follow the evidence where it leads. See, any experiment...
No, like even a robot can prove things false. And a robot doesn't have a mind. Am I wrong? Cannot a computer recognize, like using patterns and say, if X then Y, not Y, therefore not X? Right? Am I missing something?
Experiment you run to prove materialism is going to require you to have the free will and the capability to follow the evidence where it leads. If you don't have that free will or capability, if materialism is true, you can't discover it's true.
If I could put it in a nutshell, if determinism is true, you didn't choose to be an atheist and Frank didn't choose to be a Christian.
Did Frank even choose to be a Christian? Even if determinism is false?
The laws of physics handed that down to you. There's just no other way around it. You didn't follow a line of evidence and reason your way into atheism. You were going to be an atheist.
Is Winger live right now? Oh, we got to check in on him, see how he's doing.
And Frank was going to be a Christian because of brain chemistry and physics, basically.
And what may surprise you is that is what when I left my faith, that is what I had to come to terms with, and I have come to terms with it. That I don't actually deny that. I feel like the other ontologies that I used to layer on top of it was an illusion for both because of indoctrination, but also various things that I don't disagree that if I'm determined, if determinism is true, then I was determined to be an atheist.
And if Calvinism is true, then Frank's been determined to be a Christian.
Yeah, I don't even fight that one.
And what's your problem with that, Frank? In the sense, I mean, Paul's just saying, yeah, fair play. That's it.
Well, my problem is then...
Makes me feel icky. I want to be more than just a moist robot.
We're locked in agnosticism. In fact, I can't say anything better than C.S. Lewis. Let me just say what C.S. Lewis said about this. He said, suppose there were...
When in doubt, when you don't know what to say, pull out a quote.
No intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull, but if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God.
Oh my goodness. What do you say to that? And look at Paul's expression. That's so appropriate. And even Justin's expression's appropriate. Mm-hmm. Yep, you preach it there, Frank. It's such a gish gallop of spaghetti apologetics that where do you even start? I feel like I need to play some Enya music here.
Yeah, so I don't think I nod my head to all that, except that the way that C.S. Lewis could have made determinations is to make predictions and test them and see if they work. And again, I know you need your own senses, so you do have to have some presuppositions. We have to presume that our senses are reliable enough. We have to presume that the universe can be learned about. There are some.
Sounds like some of the stuff I say.
That is something else I had to come to. I wish more non-Christians would agree that there are some presuppositions that we carry.
Oh, Frank
and
agrees.
we just basically have to. There's some brute facts.
Let's leave that there for the moment, because to be honest, this.
To be honest, I'm going to lose viewers if we talk about precept arguments and the tag arguments.
Is the stuff of sci-fi. I've just been watching, funnily enough, a whole sci-fi series recently on the question of whether the universe is determined and all the kind of weird anomaly. Well, no, let's start with Frank, actually, just to spell out, because you do, in the final chapter, Frank, talk about this. And do you want to just spell out the ways in which you think Jesus kind of embodies these characteristics, but kind of perfects them as well, and becomes
this
someone
is good.
who couldn't simply be
I remember
invented,
this.
ultimately had to kind of be the true hero.
Right. Well, from a macro sense, Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice who all the other superheroes kind of look toward. Iron Man sacrifices himself to save his universe, and he dies in order to allow other people to live. And of course, Iron Man goes from a playboy over a lot of moral development, ultimately becomes a sacrificial hero. And you can take elements from all these different superheroes. And as you mentioned, Justin, we do Captain America, Iron Man, Wonder Woman, Harry Potter,
Lord of the Rings,
Batman, Star Wars, of course. But there's something perfect about Jesus. First of all, he's morally perfect. Captain America is kind of a static moral hero who doesn't really develop morally, but he's not morally perfect. He can still be a hair splitter and annoy people with his righteousness, like Jesus never does, right? Jesus is full of truth, but he's also full of grace. Jesus is full of holiness, but he's also full of approachability. Jesus is
tell that to the people in the temple when he was overturning tables.
Exceedingly strong, but he's also tender. He's confident, but he's also humble. He's completely...
You know what I need to do? I need to make a promo video for my channel. And then I'll say, here's Frank Turek talking about PineCreek and the PineCreek channel. He's strong, but he's tender.
Mission-oriented to give his life to save the world, but he's also loving. And you don't find this in any character in fiction or nonfiction throughout history.
Muhammad. I swear I've heard this before from Muslims talking about Muhammad.
You don't find this kind of character. In fact, someone put it this way: if Jesus didn't exist, he couldn't have been invented. He is.
Oh my goodness. Where have I heard this before? Muslims. If Allah didn't exist, there's no way the Quran could be written by men. Like, this is all similar apologetics to Islam, Frank. But Islam's false. I get it. But do you at least understand and hear yourselves using the exact same arguments? One argument leads to truth. The same argument leads to falsities. I mean, you guys like to call me a skeptic. As a skeptic, I'm confused. Who do I follow? The Muslims or the Christians? When I'm hearing them say the exact same things. Somebody help me.
It's just a character that is unfound in any other nonfiction or fiction anywhere. And I could go into a lot more detail, but I want to give Paul an opportunity to respond, because I know he thinks differently of this.
So one of the interesting things about, there's no character like this. He's very perfect. I'm not sure if Frank has heard this term before, but there's a term in fandom called Mary Sue. and a Mary Sue character is a character that is too perfect to be real. And the Mary Sue designation came up to specifically designate lazy writers, and in most specifically...
Too perfect to be true, lazy writers. You know, Paul's talking about the Gospels right now, right? But he's doing it using, something off the Gospels. Oh, this is good. Good job, Paul.
When fans go and write fan fiction about Harry Potter or Star Wars or Twilight or whatever, the fans typically tend to put in characters that are too perfect. They don't have problems. And that's considered to be lazy writing. That's not considered to be some kind of miracle that someone came up with a perfect character. And so, you use Harry Potter. The Harry Potter book I thought was great. Chapter in your book, pardon me, was great. Outlining exactly how Harry Potter is just way too perfect. Like, because he's supposed to be this allegory.
Yeah, and same with Superman. Like the more recent Superman, it's way too perfect. You give too much power to a superhero, and I lose interest. There has to be some faults, and I guess with Superman, it's just the kryptonite, right?
So again, I was surprised when I got to that point in your book where you said this character is so perfect that these people who weren't literary geniuses couldn't come up with them, when the exact opposite is true. The worse writer you are, the fewer flaws you tend to give your characters. So that just really seemed like a strange argument to me.
Well, the reason, I think the difference here is, I agree with you that in fiction, it's hard to develop a perfect character, but Jesus is not a boring character.
What did he just say? In fiction, it's hard to develop a perfect character?
The reason, I think the difference here is, I agree with you that in fiction, it's hard to develop a perfect character, but...
Well, I guess he used the word develop. What do you mean by develop? But I think it would be easy to write about at least the perfect character. You can easily conceive of this perfect character. But I guess what he means is, what's the fun in that? Like, if you don't have a building up and a climax and a resolution, then the story is boring. I think that's what he means.
Jesus is not a boring character.
Yeah, that's exactly what he means.
He's still timeless. He's the most influential human being in history. And
not according to that one book. It's Muhammad.
For him to have that kind of impact and have that character where he has that perfect tension between grace and truth, between strength and tenderness, between confidence and humility, you don't find that anywhere else. So I agree with you. If you just made him morally perfect and that was it, there was nothing else to him.
It sounds like the reason people don't like the Mary Sue characters is because they're flat and boring rather than they're perfect necessarily. Is that what I'm getting the sense?
No, not necessarily. Usually they're the best, and I don't want to go off this too long, but usually they're like they've accomplished something really amazing at a young age, or they've typically, they pull out this superpower that they've got just at the right moment. It's one of those things. But I know in your book, Frank, you talked about how Jesus always had the perfect retort, and always had the perfect thing to say, and which of us ever have those perfect retorts? And I guess if you look at the Bible like I do as legendary development, as a something that a story that evolved for several years before it was first written down, then what you're looking at is narrative natural selection. You're looking at the stories about Jesus that most affected people and most brought in converts. Those are the stories that were kept.
Paul, don't you realize that there's Christians listening? Shh. Can't say these things. Don't say these things. They can hear you, Paul.
And anytime there was friction, they had, the writer of Mark didn't have to come up with this whole cloth. There was oral tradition. I think you would agree that there was decades of oral tradition. You even say so in your book, that happened before that. It's not, so I'm skeptical whether Jesus actually said those retorts, whether that conversation actually happened the way it did.
Okay, well, I would ask you, why do you think he didn't say it, and who did say it?
I'm assuming that no one said these things, that these were stories about Jesus that may have been inspired by an actual conversation, but over the decades, Jesus's retort got sharper and sharper, and one of his followers who came up with a better way to explain it and a better way to say it.
Yeah, the quick way to answer, like, I got to be fair and criticize Paul just as much as I do Christians. The question is, why do you think Jesus never said these things? Just say, because it's based on oral tradition, and humans are fallible and get things wrong. Right? Another good answer would be because there are definitely things that Jesus said in the Gospel of John that we'd expect him to say in Mark and didn't. Like, before Abraham I am. That's pretty important stuff. And you can like give examples.
That's the one everyone picked up on. Just like you kind of see in sermons, you kind of see when you go to as many churches as you do, I'm sure you start to hear some of the same phrases used in sermons because those are the ones that work to win converts. So I guess I would need to be convinced that the stories of Jesus actually happened if I'm to, as a prerequisite before I'm going to look at the Bible and say, oh, well, he was very witty in his retort against the sect.
This is so dangerous because this is just basically what Paul is saying here is just obliterating the foundation that Christians of the sort of Frank Turek rely on. Their firm foundation, Paul's taking a jackhammer and going and just poking holes in it. Like if a Christian who follows Frank Turek for 1 second even entertains the idea that Jesus may not have said something that is reported Jesus saying something, where does it stop? Where does it end? I'm not talking about all versions of Christianity. I'm talking about Frank Turek's version of Christianity because he worships the Bible. Because the Bible is God's word. And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. That's Jesus. The Bible equals Jesus. Kind of. You get what I'm saying.
Sadducees, isn't that amazing?
Right. Well, let me say that this is not my primary argument
I
that
understand.
Jesus is God. All right. I'm going to look at the evidence for the resurrection. This is kind of more of a probability argument here, dealing with.
Isn't Jesus' resurrection a probability argument too?
What admittedly are subjective
Right.
assessments here. Okay, that we're talking about literature here. But let me just ask this:
Isn't the stuff about Jesus' resurrection subjective arguments too? So and so saw Jesus rise from the dead. Apparently, that's a subject.
It seems to me, how does the same consistent character of Jesus come through in all four biographies that were written in different parts of the ancient world?
Whoa,
So Matthew,
whoa,
Mark,
whoa, whoa, whoa. How do you know that? How do you know that all four Gospels were written in 4 different places in the world? Oh, I need Trent Horn here. Well, that's just speculation. You guys saw that video I did with Trent Horn versus the red-haired cowboy, Jimmy Akin? Are you speculating or do you know this with like 99% confidence? Wouldn't it be hilarious that if all 4 Gospels were written in the same luxurious hotel in Rome, Italy? And then when John, the last Gospel is writing, he looks on the wall of the hotel and says, Mark was here.
and Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in different places when they write their Gospels. How does all
How does he know these? Maybe he's right, but how does he know this? Can someone help me? I'm quite confident that Paul was in different places when he wrote his letters, but how exactly does he know this? Is there any historian here or a historian buff who has any reason, can give me reasons to think that you can be highly confident that they were written in 4 different places? Like, I admit they were written for 4 different audiences, or a couple different audiences, but he's talking about places here.
this come through if Jesus was a legend or each writer heard different invented stories about
Well, I think
Jesus?
you would agree that Mark is a primary source for Luke and Matthew, right?
He might be a primary source or one of the sources, but if you look at Luke,
He might be. He might be. The only way he can say he might be is if he doesn't think Mark was the first gospel written, which, Frank Turek, if you say that, you're going against the consensus of scholarship, and that's how we figure out what is historical truth, according to Gary Habermas. According to 75% of New Testament historians, Mark was indeed the first gospel ever written. And Matthew quotes Mark word for word in many, close to half of the pages of Matthew quotes Mark, so therefore they're not independent.
Luke has a lot of material that is not found in Mark.
And some of that may be either Matthew borrowed from Luke or they both borrowed from a Q source. I mean, to say that they pulled from a consistent oral tradition. So one of the things you mentioned in your book, you mentioned Batman when he came out in Detective Comics. When he started out, Batman fired guns and used to kill people. You know, that was a thing. And then over the decades, the Batman that we know and love emerged. And similar with Superman. When Superman first came out in Action Comics, he couldn't fly. He wasn't bulletproof. You know, all those things.
Really? Superman couldn't fly? What's so super about him then?
These were characteristics that in the first couple decades of these characters' lives, the writers figured out what the audiences liked and what they didn't like.
You see what Paul's doing here, right? Batman started out shooting people. Superman started out walking, not flying. And then over time, Superman's flying. Batman is more moral now. He's describing how Jesus developed, the story of Jesus.
That was a great analogy for what I think happened with the Jesus stories.
Yeah.
The Jesus stories got a couple of decades of honing, you know, amongst his followers. And that
Paul, next time use the word fine-tuning. The Gospels have gone through decades of fine-tuning, which proves that God exists. The fine-tuning argument for the Gospels.
Me perfectly adequately explains why you get a consistent nature combined with what I think are clear literary dependencies. Even John, most like Keener and others, forgive me if it's not Keener, maybe it's Allison.
No, you're right.
John seems to
Keener.
have had a copy of Mark available to him, whether or not he directly used it. So, you know, for me, those literary dependencies are easily enough to say he's roughly consistent.
Well, yeah, he is consistent, but as I say, they're all written in different areas by different people who are writing to different audiences. You know, Matthew's writing more to the Jewish audience, as you know, whereas Luke is writing to a Roman audience. I mean, they're writing to different people, and they all seem to have a consistent character of Jesus, even though there are different stories about Jesus in those four different Gospels. And it's
you know, you could probably come. I can't do this off the top of my head, but he says they all come up with the consistent character of Jesus. Really? Is Jesus God in the Gospel of Mark? I mean, is it clear that Jesus is God in the Gospel of Mark? Is it clear that Jesus is God in the Gospel of John? They're different, and this is like you can't get. This is like, who is Jesus? In Mark, it seems like Jesus is like filled. He's almost demon possessed with God's Spirit at baptism. The Spirit infilled him, and that's when he became super Jesus. In John, it's like before Abraham existed, he was Superman Jesus. And then there's other little things like Jesus's views on whether miracles can be more effective to saving souls than the scriptures. The Jesus in Luke is like, no, don't. Even if someone comes back from the dead, if they don't believe based on the scriptures, they're not going to believe. Whereas in John said, no, miracles is this is what convinces some people. Not all, but a lot. Don't poo-poo miracles. So which is the real Jesus?
It's more likely that this character Jesus actually existed and said these things, or these four different writers in different parts of the ancient world somehow came up with this same amazing character through some sort of scrambling legend.
They're not the same, and I would even say they're not amazing. Like the character of Jesus that they developed is not that amazing. Like a guy saying, I've come here with a sword to divide people, to turn a son against his father. That's me, Jesus. I said those things. If anybody pulls you away from me, you hate them. Jesus said these things. Now, maybe Frank calls that amazing. I don't.
It's in the same way Matt Reeves and Tim Burton and why am I blanking on the other trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy? Those directors all came up with incredibly different Batman stories, but yet the core of
Oh yeah, don't get me started on hell. Jesus is an amazing character, and then he says, "If you deny me in front of people, I will deny you in front of my Father." Nah, 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 nah. That's Jesus. He's a na 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 guy. Right? Like, how you think Trump is narcissistic? Wait until you get a hold of Jesus. I mean, I'll make sure your body is destroyed and your soul if you say anything bad about me. Even Trump doesn't go that far. Whew. Whew. That was harsh. Because I'm on record saying Trump is like the worst role model president we've ever had, and I'm saying Jesus was worse than Trump. I mean, no evangelical's ever going to watch my channel again.
Well,
right, but they're fiction,
I think the stories about Jesus are fictional. Like, if you look at it that way.
Wait. So you're saying the most...
Oh, no.
The most influential...
I did a bit of a monologue there, so I got to back up. This sounds good.
At the core of... Well,
right, but they're fiction,
I think the stories about Jesus are fictional. Like, if you look at it that way.
No, you can't say that in front of Frank. This is Frank Turek. You can't say the Gospels are fictional just like that in front of him, because then he'll lean over, and he's getting older, and he'll fart. That pressure builds up. It has to escape somewhere. Right now, Frank is farting. Come on, Frank. Laugh a little. I know you're listening.
You're saying the most influential human being in history never existed.
No, I think Jesus... I totally...
Now, how can Frank be an intelligent guy and get that from what Paul said? So you're saying Jesus never existed? Because you said the stories were fictional. Have you never heard of mytho-history, Frank? That you can have a real character and a story built around it? Come on, Frank. Where did Frank go to school? I tell you, that public education, no good for Frank. Can't think.
I will fight anyone. I think Jesus existed, but I think that the stories that emerged about him in the decades later are, again, I cannot emphasize enough how much Luke and Matthew just blatantly copied Mark. Like, that's... If you had a copy of Mark with you, it's very unsurprising.
Well, can we come back to this after a quick break?
Can we stop bashing the Gospels? We'll take a break here. No, Paul is exactly right. It is incest. The Gospels are incest. Luke knew Paul. Paul knew Peter. Peter knew Mark. Mark and Matthew and Luke knew John. They all knew each other. There's no independence going on here. This was a story. Now, I'll go even further, and I haven't heard any of my atheist brethren say this. At least, I'm sure Arn Ra would say this. But I'll go even further. If, I said if 3 times, Christians, did you hear that? If the traditional view of who wrote the Gospels is true, and I don't think it is, but if it were true, I'm here to say it is indeed people getting together to lie for a greater good. In other words, I'm saying they got their stories together, and even they couldn't agree on how to keep their stories straight. So that's why you see differences in the Gospels. But for the most part, if the traditional authorship is true, Jesus did not rise from the dead, and they say he did. But they lied. Not that they're mistaken. No, they purposely lied to you. And guess what? Even if you think this is insane what I'm saying, it is still more likely than a man rose from the dead, walked on water, and flew into the heavens after he walked around for 40 days. It's still way more likely. I dare you to disagree with me. I double dog dare you to say it's more likely that a man rose from the dead than people get together and lie and say certain things happened when they didn't. Too harsh?
Sure.
We'll see how Frank responds to this, because I think we're getting to some interesting territory to movies, to the Gospels, and philosophical issues around determinism and morality. We've gone the whole gamut on today's show. But we are kind of in the middle of talking through sort of the question of whether, yes, the character of Jesus is essentially a fictionalized, coned, cleaned up character. You know, Paul's been making the analogy with some of the movies, you know, where we've seen the evolution of characters like Batman and Superman in different ways. And he says, well, could
See, Justin is demonstrating that he's listening to Paul. That's good.
it been the same with Jesus? Yes, maybe there was an original person, but the stories kind of changed shape, developed into this perfect, you know, the person that you say, this is the reason why we can trust that this person really was who he claimed to be, Jesus, the Son of God. Actually, maybe it was just people kind of shaped him into that kind of character over time, Frank. So let's have a bit more back and forth between you on this. Firstly with you, Frank, and then we'll come to the end.
Yeah, as I say, you need some other information from the outside to really make a determination as what makes the most sense, because all the writers of the New Testament, except for Luke, were all baptized Jews who believed Yahweh was their God. They already were God's chosen people. They had no motive to invent any of this.
Really, Frank? No motive? No motive to invent any of this stuff. What about to give people hope? You know, some people would say that's a good motive. To give people hope, even if it's false. People are on deathbeds every day, and people say things to them moments before they die. I bet you anything, and say things that are not true, but it gives the dying person comfort. Hey, thanks, Spencer, for the donation. Do you think the Bible is the greatest literary work of all time, considering its context? If not, what beats it and why? I'm not for its time or all time. You said all time. No, for all time, no. What beats it? The screenplays of Quentin Tarantino beats the Bible, hands down.
They had every
someone who's more refined than me might even say Shakespeare.
motive to say it wasn't true, not every motive to say it was true, because by saying a man claimed to be God, first of all, that was blasphemy. They didn't think a man could claim to be God. They didn't think somebody would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They only thought somebody would rise from the dead at the end of time. So for them,
can you say that about all Jews? There's clearly some Jews who thought differently, right, Frank?
them to say that a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead in the middle of time, when they had no motive to say otherwise, could only really be explained by a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead in the middle of time. Because
Yeah, like Christianity started with Paul. Like the records of Christianity started with Paul. What we have recorded started with Paul. And I think I could get, Frank, I could find you Orthodox Jews and Muslims who could say Paul had motive to make some of this crap up. Sorry for using the word crap. I apologize. I'm usually a clean-mouthed boy. Like, I don't even have to do it. I can find theists who believe that God exists who can say Paul was a shyster. He was a no good con man. And they would even say, Paul was in it for the money. Oh, but he died for his beliefs. Yeah, how do you know that? Even the details of Paul's death we can't know with high confidence. Sure, he was jailed, but so was Joseph Smith. And if you read 2 Corinthians 9 and 1 Corinthians 9, like you don't even have to go into those passages, but hey, Christians, let me jar your memory. Do you remember Paul saying something about things like, I'm not in it for the money. I'm not doing this for earthly rewards. That's an example of a man protesting too much. That tells me that there were people at the time who were saying the things I'm saying, that they were suspicious of Paul, that he was going from church to church and collecting money. And I think it's 2 Corinthians 9 where he basically says, thank you for this big gift that you're about to give me. I would not be surprised if Paul was in it for the money. And I could also say that it was Paul's letters that paved the foundation for even the Gospels. I think Mark relies on Paul. And then all the Gospels rely on Mark. And the reason why we can't have high confidence on these things is because the evidence is terrible. The evidence is way better for Mormonism. That's why we can say, oh yeah, we can be confident that Joseph Smith was a con man. But that's because we have stuff from non-Mormons about his life. We don't have anything about Jesus, what he did when he was 18, 20, written by people at that time who knew him. Nothing. We only have the good stuff about Jesus. And even that's written decades later. Thanks, Jacob Smith. Okay, Jacob Smith.
Hey, man! This makes sense!
Yeah, so even Frank agrees with what I just said.
Because they got beaten, tortured, and killed for saying this was true, and they had no
You do not know
motive to
this.
invent it. So I don't see this as an invented story. Our friend,
They always go back to martyrdom again and again and again and again. The martyrdom, trust me, guys, the martyrdom aspect, the martyrdom apologetic is probably the most powerful one for Christians, like what their go-to. Please, just study this stuff. We don't know exactly why they died, if they could have lived, if they recanted, and so forth, and what exactly they died for. You're assuming so much. And there are people, I think, in history who have died knowing it's a lie for posterity or for some greater good.
Wallace, the cold case homicide detective, says whenever he finds a dead body that he knows has been murdered, he says there's only 3 reasons why that guy's dead. There's not 1,000 reasons. There's only 3, or one of these 3, or a combination thereof. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue.
Yeah, I would say with the money and power is on the table with the New Testament. Now, the sex one, yeah, probably that too. Wouldn't it be funny? This is speculative. Trent Horn, if you're listening, this is all speculation. But what if the thorn in Paul's side was that he was addicted to going to the brothels once a week? What if Paul was like Ravi Zacharias and liked to get massaged in certain places? Christians, do you think for 1 second that that's impossible? Ravi Zacharias would get massaged in his happy place and then go to his hotel room and write a book that people like Frank Turek would listen and read to. You really think that's impossible for Paul to do? My letter to the Corinthians. Hang on a second. I'm going to go get a massage first because that will help me write better. You know why I love this? I love this because if there's a Christian listening, thought is going to be stuck in their head now, and it will be never removed. Listening to my words is like watching porn. Once you see it, you can't forget it, right?
And so he said, if you're going to try and say that a conspiracy was done here or people invented this, you'd have to have one or more of those three motivators. And I don't see the New Testament writers getting sex, money, and power for saying any of this was true. They had no motive to invent it. So for me, that makes me think this really happened. And I can't see
Jerry.
how a fictional character or somebody that we only know just a shady amount about, because all this was legendary development, as Paul is putting forth, could somehow become the most influential human being in history.
You know, it's ideas that become influential. Like, look at, it could be true that Socrates never, ever, ever existed. But the Socratic method lives on. It could be true that Jesus is not God and never rose from the dead. Yet these ideas live on. And the reason why Jesus became the most influential, in your opinion, Frank, is because of the Roman Empire, who made it an official religion. And guess what? They had roads. They had the infrastructure. I tell you, if the Amish were in power back then, you know, Jesus would be who? Who's Jesus?
Unless something like something dramatic like the resurrection took place. Let's go back to Star Wars for a second. Does any of us here really believe that 2,000 years from now, a fictional character like Luke Skywalker is going to be the most influential human being over the previous 2,000 years?
Okay.
Well, yeah, but there's a little bit of difference because we have technology now, and we have ample evidence that this was a screenplay written for the purpose of a movie, and that there were, as Paul said, the purpose was to sell dolls and toys. Like, if we knew this stuff 2,000 years ago, hey, we're going to make this religion up, and our whole goal here is to sell Jesus dolls. You know, with the long hair and the dress. I mean, the robe.
Go ahead, Paul.
You said a lot of things there, so I want to try and go back and remember them one at a time. But I do have things to talk about with all
Action
of them. So
figures,
the first
right?
is that you were talking about. I never posited that the writers of the Gospels invented anything. What I feel like the writers of the Gospels did was they codified decades of oral tradition.
Yeah, but I would say, Paul, you didn't have to concede that. I think you can say that it's pretty clear the author of the Gospel of John did invent stuff. And I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think even Michael Licona and Craig Keener admit this. That they invented words and put it on Jesus's lips. Am I wrong about this? If Camille's listening, he can verify or say I'm wrong.
Now, in your book, you specifically call out Christians and saying, you know what, the early people didn't have a New Testament. They listened to the oral tradition. So it seems like you agree with me that those oral traditions were around, and that 20 years later, pretty much anyone could have written
But that
them
doesn't
down.
mean that the oral traditions are wrong, because there's eyewitness details about them.
But certainly what I don't need, you're positing why would the writers invent it? And I don't think the writers invented anything. I think they were just writing down what was believed. And that seems to be what you said in the book as well. So
I disagree with that. I think the writers invented stuff. For example, and I think Richard Carrier has said this, that the author of the Gospel of John invented the Lazarus story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. You stinketh, so now I raiseth you. As a complete 180 reversal of the Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. It's no coincidence, I don't believe, that you have two Lazaruses in two Gospels telling opposing stories. One that miracles are poo-pooed, and the other one, miracles are thumbs up.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying the Hollywood Heroes book isn't really doing a lot of apologetics in that regard. That's from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, my other book. But my main point here is to say that they're not inventing it, and they witnessed a lot of this because there's eyewitness details throughout the text. So it's not like they...
How do you know there's eyewitness details in the text? How do you get there? Like, let's pretend for a second, Frank, that the Gospels are 100% fiction. You could read it and see exactly everything the same, but that's just part of the story. Jesus said this, blah, blah, blah. And then Jesus appeared to the women, blah, blah, blah. And then Jesus appeared to Peter, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now just pretend that that never happened in history. You wouldn't say these are eyewitness sources. You would say this is part of the story, right?
It's not like decades later they said, hey, let's take all these legendary stories and put them into a biography. These people either were eyewitnesses or knew eyewitnesses in the case of Luke, and then they wrote it down. And I think you can show that by looking at...
Does Luke even say himself that he knew eyewitnesses or talked to eyewitnesses? No. Read the first chapter of Luke. I think he just says that I've compiled together from the very beginning. But that doesn't mean he actually knew eyewitnesses and talked to them and interviewed them. This is a common misconception that Christians have. But of course, the Roman Catholics are right, and Luke was a companion of Paul, so then therefore it's true. Then what Frank's saying is true.
In the text.
So you and I drastically agree. I don't think any of the gospel writers are eyewitnesses of anything, but I want to go to, you kind of threw a bunch of things in there, so we can come back to that if you're interested. We can talk about whether the gospel writers knew it, witnessed anything. But then you also threw to essentially to J. Warner Wallace's Person of Interest book, which is, this Jesus had the greatest influence in history, therefore something. I don't know, therefore what. But what I would love to hear, and I would from you or from Jay, from Jim, where's that threshold? So you talked about, well, Jesus came along at a certain time, and he influenced culture, and he influenced music, and he influenced all these things, and a lot of scientists were Christians, and great. But where's that correlation? Not where.
Hey, thank you, Jerry Amaya. Keep up the good work. Nice commentary. PineCreek here because of the Dr. Price interview. Well, thank you so much.
How can you show me that it's causation, not merely correlation? Obviously, when science came into fruition, most of the money and most of the research was happening in churches. So, where is the point? And if Jesus hadn't existed, you'd have to admit that someone would be the most popular person. If not Jesus, someone else would be.
Good point.
Where do we find some kind of magic line to say, oh, this much popularity can be explained, but this level of Jesus popularity means divine? Like, what is in this gap that turns popularity from just being Beatles popular to...
Yeah, well, it's a good
divine?
question. It's not like physics, Paul, I don't think, or mathematics. You don't say, oh, once you hit this point, you got, this guy is God. No, we're not saying that. This is just one argument out of...
No, I think you are saying that, Frank, because you alluded to that when you said, do we really think 2,000 years ago Luke Skywalker is going to become like this divine figure? No. So the fact that Jesus is viewed as this perfect, most influential person means that there's something more about him. He wasn't merely just a man, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
Many, it's circumstantial that to have the most influential human being in history be a man from an obscure corner of the Roman Empire who never wrote a book, never traveled more than 200 miles from his home, never actually led an army, held political office, never did any of the things that we would consider today to be great, and yet he's the center of human history. How does this happen unless something dramatic like a resurrection takes place? It seems that...
What if it was just a belief in a resurrection? What is different? What's the difference when you talked about cause and effect earlier? When you see the effect, the cause could be either that he was resurrected, or that people sincerely believe he resurrected. Would those not create the exact same cause?
If people sincerely believed and were mistaken, but it would have been very easy to stop Christianity in its tracks in the very beginning. It would have just go to the tomb and take out his body. Would have been over.
What if he was thrown in a mass grave like almost most of them were?
Well, according
and there wasn't a tomb that they
according
knew
to the
where he was.
best evidence we have, he wasn't put in a mass grave, and his tomb was claimed to be empty. And the Romans and the Jews could have, if they were the ones that disposed the body, even in a mass grave, they could have said, "Let's go get the body and show everybody."
Decades
No.
later?
This happened very early. Even Bart Ehrman from UNC Chapel Hill, who's probably the top skeptic in the world today, says the earliest evidence for the resurrection, even though he doesn't believe in the resurrection, is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which is...
Thank you for the donation, Bow and Arrow. Where did Luke get his genealogy, and why was it in 3 groups of 14 generations, aka pi 3.14? That's an interesting one.
Is an ancient creed that he says goes all the way back within a year or so of the supposed event.
This is crazy.
Skeptic in the world today says the earliest evidence for the resurrection, even though he doesn't believe in the resurrection, is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which is an ancient creed that he says goes all the way back within a year or so of the supposed event.
If I had a text that goes back within a week or so, not a year, but a week or so, that my ancestor flew across the Grand Canyon, would you be more likely to believe it? No. Christians, I really think you got to stop saying stuff like this, because you really do just make yourselves look silly. It shows nothing about the veracity of the belief. Someone can come up to you within an hour and say, "I saw PineCreek walk on water." You think you're going to believe it because it's an hour? Come on.
So
I actually had Bart on my channel last week to talk about Gary Habermas saying that very thing, and Bart disagrees. Bart says that's not what he believes.
Well, maybe he's changing his tune, because he did believe that at one point. It's an early creed. In fact, there's 41 creeds in the New Testament that go...
Yeah, and how in the world would anybody know that it goes back to within a year? What if Paul heard that from Peter, and this whole idea just arose, I don't know, a month before Paul wrote it? How would you know that or not? You can't.
Way back to the events themselves.
I would say that in a way, we've moved into the territory, obviously, of debating the biblical evidence and everything else. It's interesting, though, that for you, Jesus, I mean, I guess you're willing to grant, presumably, Paul, that Jesus has had a massive cultural influence and everything else. So you're not denying any of that. Your view is, though, that doesn't elevate him to the status of divine just on the basis of the extraordinary influence that this relatively unknown person, in his day has gone on to have.
Right. As an interesting example, like when the book Person of Interest book came out, Jim was talking a lot about how we could recreate the Bible from other sources. So I took it upon myself to recreate Star Wars Episode 4 entirely from clips from other movies. And you can actually go on my YouTube channel and watch a half-hour version of Star Wars Episode 4 without a single clip from anything that Lucasfilm ever made.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. That's a good outsider test for faith right there.
It's just the fact that something becomes popular enough that it becomes referenced and referenced and referenced just means that it became popular. It doesn't mean that there's anything,
Yeah, I'm just wondering why Christianity would become popular in the ancient world when you could be killed for becoming a Christian.
Because the Roman Empire made it legal. Not to kill Christians, but the religion itself. That's how it got popular. Christianity was not that big in the first 100 or 200 years. Am I wrong about that? I think Ehrman cites certain studies on that.
Well, you could, but again, I don't know how much Justin wants us to go into the history, but that was happening sporadically, and it was terrible that it was happening, but it didn't happen to everyone. Most Christians, lived their lives just fine, and then, of course, when most Christianity grew in the 4th century, it became a protected thing. I understand that it lived some dark days. But
Does anyone know? I could have sworn I made a video about the influence of Muhammad in Islam compared to the influence of Jesus in Christianity. And I did a side by side, didn't I? I did a short video of Muslims and Christians using the exact same apologetic and coming to different conclusions. But I can't find it. If anybody can find it, they'll get 1,000 Pine points. But it's not that important. So,
and again, I don't know how many supposed witnesses there were to the resurrection and what happened to them. So again, it's tough to know what's the difference. For me, it always comes down to, can you differentiate between people sincerely believing and being wrong, or the actual event happening? And I have yet to see what the magic element is that requires that it be true. If you're making a probabilistic argument, that's one thing. But
I agree with you,
sure.
Paul. Nothing's required to be true in this regard. This is an historical event, so we're dealing in probability. And I agree that just because Jesus is the most influential human being in history doesn't mean he's divine. I agree with that. It's just one piece of evidence among many.
to show what? One piece of evidence to show what?
That's really the issue that I'm saying. I think there's a whole cascade of pieces of evidence that when you put them all together. In fact, here's one thing we don't have time to discuss, but I know you've discussed it before, Justin, on this show, and that is undesigned coincidences, right? That point out that the New Testament writers, particularly
This is, in my opinion, he's bringing this up because he's conceding a point to Paul, and for his followers listening, this is not good. It's not good for me as a longtime Christian apologist to concede that this atheist YouTuber is right. So let me put my hand into this vat of spaghetti and throw this against the wall and see if it sticks. Undesigned coincidences.
gospel writers could not have invented this. They independently, at least to a certain extent, witnessed the same historical events because there are undesigned coincidences in the text. And so it didn't all.
No, when this was brought up by, what's his name, Tim McGrew to Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman says, this undesigned coincidences can be explained that they're not independent. They are dependent. I would not be surprised, and I don't think Bart Ehrman would be surprised, or any New Testament historian be surprised, that the author of the Gospel of John had Matthew, Luke, and Mark open on his desk while he wrote, and knew these texts very well. Okay, this certain scene 5, chapter 4. Who would have been there? Oh, yeah, this makes sense. Undesigned coincidences. Yeah.
All come from one source. This has a real grounding in history.
We're going to have to leave it there.
Okay, we'll leave it there. And I couldn't find that video, but I did find this one. What is this one? An atheist brings Muslims and Christians together. Who's this atheist? That's me.
Is a prophet, to believing that Muhammad ﷺ is a prophet, to believing that his companions truly believed in him and followed him to the point where the first decade there was literally hardly any reason to motivate them to hold on to that belief.
Oh yeah, this is the whole motivation thing. Money, power, sex. There's no motivation for Muhammad to lie. There's no money, power, and sex involved.
They were being tortured. They were being persecuted. There was zero reason for them to hold on.
11 of the 12 died martyrs' deaths, went through horrible torture, some of the worst torture in history.
And there was zero reason to motivate Muhammad ﷺ to keep pushing it. He was being offered power. He was being offered money. He was being offered women. He was being offered all of these things. And he was watching people he loved dearly being tortured.
He was being offered 9-year-old girls.
If the resurrection was a lie, they had to know it. Look, in their own words, they said for 40 days. They lived with him with many convincing proofs that he'd been raised from the dead.
It says it in the text. For 40 days they walked with him, and they sat down and went to Red Lobster with Jesus. Because Jesus liked to eat fish. Dead men don't eat fish. Therefore, he was alive.
And he still rejected to stop preaching about Islam, to stop calling people away from shirk, from polytheism, and to call them to the worship of one God.
And if that wasn't true, then they had to know it.
That's his gateway into Islam. He says, let's look at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's either one of these things or he's telling the truth.
That Jesus is not.
Oh. Thank you, Jerome. We'll play that next. Thank you. 1,000 pine points to Jerome.
A lunatic. Lunatics don't.
Oh, yeah. Let me rewind this one.
To Islam. He says, let's look at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's either one of these things or he's telling the truth.
That Jesus is not a lunatic. Lunatics don't heal sick people, raise dead people, and dominate demons.
And if you can come up to me with all of these objections and I can show you why these are not the case.
Nor is Jesus a liar. Nor is he the cleverest, perhaps, of all deceivers, because liars don't raise dead people either. So really, we're left with one alternative with regard to Jesus, unless you want to join those who think he's a lunatic or those who think he's the greatest liar of all time. You're left with one option, and that is the option that he is who he claimed to be.
Then voila, he's not a liar, he's not mad, he's not evil, he's not doing it for power, he's not doing it for XYZ.
This is a 2-for-1 deal. I'm basically destroying two religions in one little video. I'm not destroying it, but I'm basically showing that you guys are using the exact same arguments, coming to different conclusions, claiming you have better evidence. So that's why your argument works and the other person's doesn't. But you have to admit this, Muslims and Christians, that you sound exactly the same to the atheist listening.
The life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is evidence enough to dispute these objections. And that's a case of studying his life.
And the principle of embarrassment goes like this. If there's something embarrassing in the text, it's probably true.
There are events in his life that some people would consider embarrassing, right, that were mentioned as well, with respect to his family members and other such things.
Well, the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details.
Oh, man. That was so good, if I do say so myself. Okay, and thank you to Jerome. This one's only 1 minute 1 minute and a half. I remember making this video September 3rd, 2021, and this is true. This literally helps Christians and Muslims. I mean, it is so uncanny how you're saying the exact same things and thinking for 1 second that this is a good reason to believe it. Or even gets you it shouldn't even move the needle. Because if Christianity is true, Islam is false. If Islam is true, then at least Frank Turek's version of Christianity is false. They both can't be true. And yet you use the exact same arguments to defend it. Can you not hear yourselves? Listen to yourselves. And I just realized by playing this clip, YouTube's going to be mad at me. Playing the Rocky song. Oh well. Upon my church, I will play Rocky. Yeah, the music was a little too loud, but I think you got the gist of it, right? You heard a few words. But yeah, I'm not an expert on these things. But Paul, good job. I'll give you a A-. The only reason why I didn't give you an A+ is you talked a little bit too much. But A- is still pretty good. Yeah, no, I won't get a copyright strike, but I'll get demonetized because of that. But I don't care. Doing it for you. At least it will be monetized, but I won't get the money. The Rocky people will. You're welcome, Stallone. Actually, Stallone doesn't get it. Who wrote that? Whoever wrote that. Paul just needs practice, Bob. See, my strength is talking off the cuff live. But if I had to do a structured whatever, then I probably could do it, but it takes time, effort. Happy birthday to whoever is having a birthday today. Whenever we have over 365 viewers, there's bound to be 1 or 2 birthdays. 1,000 Pine Points to whoever's birthday it is. Oh, I was going to say how I left Christianity for someone. I got to be a man of my word here. Quick, I'll do the 60-second version. Can I do it? Was a Christian, been in many different denominations, got married to a Christian, had 2 kids. In my mid-30s, I started to listen to opposing views and started to really try to understand them and put myself in their shoes, understand them to that degree. And then what really, I think, made a difference for me, I started asking the what's more likely question, just like Frank did. What's more likely, people lied or that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I started realizing that the trilemma argument that C.S. Lewis proposed was a terrible argument that I used to love because, you know, you're assuming that the text is true to begin with, sort of like Yellow Brick Road apologetics. And I felt like at a certain point in my life, I had seen the presence hidden in my parents' closet, and therefore I could no longer believe in Santa Claus. And then once you see that in all the other religions as well. That's it. Was that 60 seconds? My apologies to Frank Turek and Paulogia, Paul. They were both scheduled to come on and have a really mudslinging debate right here on the PineCreek channel, but we ran out of time.